This morning, Sandy had to help Emma's father with the killing. The lambs were ready and the day was dry. Last week he'd promised he would be there to lend a hand, to do what needed done. But he hadn't known then that Emma would be gone. He poured a bowl of cereal and boiled the kettle. He ate at the table, then stood by the window to drink his coffee. From there he could see the valley laid out in front of him, the brown thread of the burn unspooling through the crook of the land. Stirling squabbled on the stone dick in the corner of the garden. Sheep grazed and gossiped in the nearest field. Outside Maggie's house at the top of the road, a cockerel announced itself to the world. Beyond, the valley slipped into the sea. A glaze of salt on the glass made everything look further away than it ought to be. Yesterday, Emma left, with a bag of clothes and a few things from the bathroom. She'd be back next week for the rest, she said. And after that, who knows? She would look for a place on the mainland, Edinburgh again, most likely. And in the meantime, she'd be staying with a friend in Tallack. The timing had been a surprise, but the leaving had not. They'd talked about it for months, on and off. The thread of those conversations had grown increasingly tangled and incoherent, until it seemed the only escape was to cut loose. And though Emma had made the cut, it was Sandy who had pulled the tangle tight. He had engineered his own abandonment. After packing her things, Emma had driven the few hundred yards up to her parents' house to tell them she was going. She'd been dreading that, he knew. The weight of their disappointment loomed. Sandy was uneasy for that hour as her car sat in the driveway at Kettlester. He wanted to be there to defend himself, to explain things from his side. But he wasn't sure that he could explain, and it wasn't his place to do so. So he just waited, rubbing his palms together, glaring at the floor. Outside, the air was calmer and quieter than he'd expected. It was one of those mornings when you could hear someone talking on the other side of the valley, if there'd been anyone there to talk. Sandy's boots clopped on the tarmac, and the sheath knife in his pocket chafed with every stride. "This is home," Emma had said the first time she'd brought him here to meet her parents. Her arm had motioned all around, taking in everything they could see, and she laughed. This was the place she was brought up, the place she knew best, and the place she wanted to come back to, though she hadn't told him that yet. But that first time, as they'd stood together in front of the house, with the smell of her mother's cooking behind them, he couldn't see what she saw. Hills, fields, sheep, birds. That's all there was in the valley, and he'd felt no tug of connection to it. "Let's go in," he'd said. "It's cold." His own home might have been 25 miles away, in the grey ex-council house in Tallack, where he'd spent his childhood, and where his father still lived. Or it might have been the flat he shared in Edinburgh. He'd never thought that much about it. The question just didn't seem important. David was standing at the entrance to the shed, a basin of hot, soapy water in his hands. Setting it down on the workbench, he turned and nodded at Sandy. "I was up early, so I got the lambs in afore breakfast." "That's good," said Sandy. "How many hae we to do?" "Just 8 today. I hae things to be getting on wi' later. We can do the rest the morn, if there's able. Else I can manage mysel, if there hae's other plans." Sandy shrugged. "Tomorrow's fine." In the stock box, the animals shuffled nervously. "Ready to start, then?" David had never taught Emma how to kill and gut a lamb, nor had he taught his older daughter, Kate. He was not a traditionalist in every way, but he was in this one. Men taught their sons, so he taught Sandy. Perhaps he had imagined that knowledge being passed on further, to his own future grandson, though he never spoke such a thought aloud. But now, today, the severing of that unspoken thought was apparent to Sandy, and perhaps to David too. Today, they were only neighbours. "Darling, I'm just putting the tatties on. Make sure you're back in 20 minutes, okay?" "Aye," David shouted. He was rummaging for something in the porch cupboard, then he was gone. Mary's husband had a way of hearing without seeming to listen. It used to irritate her, but not any more. She knew he'd be back in time to eat. The sounds and smells of food filled the room, and Mary was there at the centre of it. When she married David, they'd agreed he would work the croft, she would work the house. It wasn't a business deal exactly, but it was an understanding. Both of them had their own jobs besides that. He at the oil terminal, she at the primary school in Treswick, 10 minutes' drive away. And that suited them fine. The animals didn't interest her much. She helped in the vegetable garden when she was needed, lifting potatoes or whatever it was that had to be done, and she tended the plants in the flower beds. But otherwise, most of her work had been indoors, and for 20 years or so it had seemed endless, a list from which nothing ever could be crossed. But when Mary retired last summer, the shape round which her life had turned dissolved. Until last night her daughter had lived next door. She had been right there. Now she was in Tallack, and soon, it seemed, she would be much further. A flight? A sea crossing away? The thought of Emma gone was difficult. Mary had seen Sandy arrive this morning, but she hadn't gone out to say hello. She'd stayed inside all the time he was there, not because she was angry, but because she was afraid, somehow, to involve him in her sadness. The sympathy she felt for him hadn't yet extricated itself from her own sense of loss, and there were questions of loyalty still to be answered, or at least to be asked. David would shake his head when he saw her like this, frowning, fretting, wasting her time. She was always fearing the worst, he said, and perhaps he was right. The worst hardly ever came to the worst. Today was a bad day, and tomorrow might be too. But there would be better days soon. She knew that. The front door closed again, and she heard David in the porch, taking off his boots, hanging up his jacket, unzipping his bowler suit. She took the potatoes off the hob and drained them into the sink. They didn't speak much during the meal, and they didn't say a word about Emma. Mary set the kettle on and opened the fridge. She paused, gazing in the door, bothered by something. "Oh, shite. I forgot. Maggie phoned at lunchtime. She was running out of milk, and I promised to take a pint down to her. That was hours ago. She'll be cursing me now." "No like thee to forget," said David. "No, it's not. I won't be long. Can do the washing up, please?" David nodded. "Aye, and I'll put the kettle on again when it gets home." An ocean of stars turned above the valley as Mary drove down towards Maggie's at the end of the road. Her headlights carved through the darkness, hiding everything beyond their reach. Maggie was old. She was coming on for 90 now, and had no family close enough to look after her. A sister, Ina, lived in New Zealand, and a niece too. But she'd had no children herself, and her husband, Walter, was long dead. She did well for her age, but she was not as independent as she wanted to be. David had taken on her craft more than 15 years ago, when she lost the heart and the strength for it. He'd known Maggie for as long as he'd known anyone. He grew up in the valley, as she had done, and he looked on her not exactly as a parent, Mary thought, but as much a part of his own life as if she had been, in fact, his mother. Most days, one or other of them would look in on her, check that she was okay, see what was needed. Mary didn't notice until she pulled up outside the house that something wasn't right. When she opened the front door and went in, shouting as she always did, "Aye, aye, it's only me," she found the living room empty. She went through the house, opening each door in turn, but Maggie wasn't at home. Mary went out the front door again and looked up towards Terry's house. The light was on there, and she drove the 100 yards or so, knocked and walked in. As she entered, Mary realised she was panicking. Terry was in the living room with Sandy, drinking beer. "Have you seen her?" she said. "Maggie, I mean, have you seen Maggie?" "Not recently," said Terry. "Nor me," Sandy added. "Well, not since this afternoon. She was in the park by the beach, not far from the house." "We need to look for her." "Is you sure that's necessary?" Terry asked. "No, I'm not sure," Mary said. "I don't know, but I think so. I'm going to call David." It was only a couple of minutes before David's pickup came down the road, and the three of them stood beside the gate in silence, waiting to be told what to do. Sam, David's old border collie, sat in the footwell of the passenger seat, mouth open, ears up. David grabbed 3 torches, clicked them on, then off again, one after the other, just to check. "Well," he said, "let's hae a peery look." Mary watched as the torch beams scraped this way and that across the field, then crossed the burn and began moving up the headland. She didn't trust Terry with much, especially when he'd been drinking, but she hoped he could take the task seriously. She drove back down to Maggie's house and went inside. From the west window in the living room, she could still see the torches shifting, the strange, unnatural movements puncturing the night. Mary thought back to the first time she'd been in this house, shortly before she and David married. She'd been brought to the valley to meet everyone. She was taken from house to house like an exhibit or a circus act, so that everyone could see her and speak to her and then discuss her with each other once she was gone. They came to meet Jimmy and Catherine, David's parents, then Maggie and Walter here, then to the Red House to meet Wally, and Joan up at Kettlester, where she and David now lived. When the door opened, Mary jumped, her heart thudding inside her. It was David, his coat and hat and boots still on. He looked at his wife, and then turned away. "Well, did you fin her?" Mary asked, trying to sound hopeful. David shuffled, looking at the floor, then finally back at Mary. "Aye, we fan her." Alice looked up from her desk and out of the window at a snow-covered corner of the garden and a white stretch of hill beyond. This was the first proper snow in almost a year, and it didn't look set to stay. The morning of Maggie's funeral brought an angry fit of gales and horizontal rain, and looking back, it seemed hardly to have let up since then. Now, near the end of January, this burst of clear, cold weather felt like a relief. She was distracted, trying to inspire herself to write by going back over what was already written. The book had started small, a few notes and observations about the valley made on scraps of paper. At one point, Alice thought it might become a short history of Shetland. But that wasn't what happened. In the 3.5 years she'd been working on it, the book had become something else. Something bigger in scale and yet narrower in focus. This place was the story she wanted to tell, She had read everything she could find about the valley and the surrounding area, spoken to those who knew it best. Most of the chapters were complete. The book had a shape. It was just a little blurred around the edges. Another 6 months, perhaps, and it would be done. This was the first time Alice had attempted something like this, something real. Crime novels. That's what she was known for. But when Jack, her husband, became ill, everything changed. She had just begun her last book, Beggar Man, with a deadline in front of her, and a mortgage and bills and a reputation. She kept working, kept getting up each day and going to her desk, a cup of black coffee in front of her. But she no longer cared what her characters had done or what they were going to do. She no longer cared how the pieces fit together. It was all make-believe. What was real was Jack. And Jack was dying. She found this house online a few weeks after Jack's death, when she was searching for something that might make sense. She put in an offer, and that was that. She and Jack had come to Shetland on their honeymoon, at his insistence. Their house in York sold for almost 3 times as much as this one cost, so she didn't need to think about money again for a long time. The valley had fascinated her from the very beginning. A small valley on a small island. Well, that's what she was trying to do, to contain it in words and in thoughts, to describe the place and to encompass it, not just as it once was, or was believed to be, but as it is, here, now. The book was called, provisionally, The Valley at the Centre of the World. She liked that. It made her smile. At the top of the valley, where the road began its stoop towards the sea, David parked his pickup. He felt tired, exhausted even, though he had no need to be. With Maggie gone, David was now the oldest person in the valley. And with Emma now gone too, he was the only one left who'd grown up here. He wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but it felt like a responsibility, a weight that couldn't be lifted. He had never lived anywhere else, not really. He'd gone away to work after school was done, labouring in Aberdeen. But he'd come home again after only a year. He didn't want the money enough to be away any longer. He came back to his parents' house, now Terry's house, then found a job at the oil terminal in the late 70s. Since then, he'd never considered living anywhere else. He sat in the driver's seat, looking out over his place, his present, past and future. From there, at the edge of the upper park, he could see nearly all of the valley. Alice's house, Bayview, was the closest, just up the road. Then his own house, Kettlester. Beyond Kettlester, the road curved southwest as it descended until it reached the Red House, where Sandy now lived. Flugarth lay another few hundred yards down the road. That was where he had grown up and where he had lived until moving to Kettlester with Mary after they married. His parents died just a few years apart. He'd sold their house because he had no need for it. He sold it to Terry, whose brother worked with David at Sullom Voe and who seemed, when he first came to view it, to love the house. The assumption had been that he would move in with his family, but his family never moved in. They came for weekends and summer holidays during the first couple of years, but that was about it. And then Terry began to come alone. Not for holidays exactly, but to give his family a break. He came to drink, or to dry out. Sometimes he'd arrive by himself on a Friday evening and stay until the Monday morning, hardly leaving the front door. Other times his wife would drive him to the house and let him out at the gate, abandoning him until he was ready to come back home. More recently, Terry had been staying for longer and longer periods, and for the past 6 months or so, he had lived here full-time. Terry wasn't drunk all the time. There were days when he was fully present, sensible, friendly, and good company, but he was unpredictable. Beyond Fluggerth was the house at the end of the road. The house was known as Cardy. Most often it was just called Maggie's. But Maggie now was gone. David thought again about Maggie. That night when they'd found her, crumpled against a rock on Braganus, he'd been aware of a kind of urgency inside him, a recognition, tinged with panic of something approaching an end. The thing he felt ending was not just one person, or even one generation. It was much older and had, in truth, been ending for a long time. Maggie had never said explicitly that the house and croft would be left to him, but he understood why she'd done it. She had entrusted the land to David in death, as she had done in life. She had nominated him as a kind of executor, to do what was right, to make a decision about the future. He had a question that needed to be asked. Stamping his boots at the doorstep and kicking hard against the wall, David cleared the snow from his feet before he opened the door and went inside. "Hello? Sandy, is there a boat?" There was a shuffling from the kitchen, and Sandy emerged in a thick blue woolen jumper, tattered at the cuffs. "Come in," he said. "I'm just made coffee. You must be psychic." The two men sat across the table from one another, but both were looking out of the window, over the valley, at the whitened hill and the sea, their hands clasped round the hot mugs in front of them. "Aye, looks pretty good for you there too," David said. "Just a pretty bit colder." He said nothing for a moment, and then he turned to Sandy. "I hae some news for thee," he said, then paused a second longer, trying to find the right words. "It seems Maggie may just have decided the future." "What does that mean?" "Well, she left the house and the croft to me in her will. And since I'm quite happy in me own bed, something else'll hae to live down there. I reckon I hae to offer it to thee, if thou wants it." Sandy looked away. "I'd help thee with the sheep and the other work," said David. "We can help each other. I'd be happy with that." "Has thou offered it to Emma?" Sandy asked. "Aye, I telled her the situation, but she's no thinking to come back, "OK. Well, I'll hae to think about it," said Sandy. "That's a bit of a surprise." "Well, I'll leave thee with thee thought," David said, standing up and setting his mug in the sink. Since David's visit the previous day, the question had hung in the air like a promise. Sandy wasn't sure, though, if it was a promise of good or ill. Where do I want to be? That was what it came down to. For more than 2 months he had stayed on in the Red House, living almost as though Emma were coming back. He'd done nothing to erase her from their home. In truth, he had not felt the need to fill her absence, because the space she once occupied in his life had already closed. It had closed before she left, squeezed, slowly, over months, perhaps years, as Sandy prepared himself for a loss he couldn't help but anticipate. It was a loss he did not want, that he dreaded, but which was made inevitable by his very expectation of it. "Do's shutting me out," Emma would say as he stepped back in silence from yet another convoluted discussion. And though he denied it, to her and to himself, that was almost exactly what he was doing, shutting out not her, but his need for her. He was closing himself down, retreating to a place he knew better than any other. Abandonment, Sandy understood, was more comfortable than the fear of it. Emma had chosen to leave because he had given her no choice. Since the last time he saw her, a few days after Maggie's funeral, when she'd piled the final boxes into her little Toyota, they'd had only irregular contact. She was in Edinburgh now, living not far from where they had first shared a home. He was here. By rights, it should have been Sandy who left. This was Emma's place, not his. At least, that's how it once had felt. But Sandy didn't want to go. A couple of his friends had already asked casually when he'd be moving. His father, too. But he'd brushed their questions off. He could wait until a decision was more pressing. What he had not anticipated before David's intervention was the possibility that he might not have to leave at all. That he might, in fact, remain here in the valley, alone. And what he had certainly never considered, not once, was digging himself in even deeper by taking on the croft and the house at the end of the road. Now, though, he had been forced to consider it. Sandy picked up his phone from the kitchen table. There was only one message, from Terry, which he ignored. He poured himself a whiskey and went through to the living room, then lit a fire and sat in the armchair by the window. He closed his eyes and listened to the storm as the flames gasped and raged in the grate. Alice was not easily deterred by detail. Research was the part of writing she had always most enjoyed, and getting to know this place as well and as closely as possible had been in large part the purpose of this book. Back when she was writing fiction, she would spend months in preparation for each novel. She studied forensics, analysed police procedures, learned about the science of decay. She built a world piece by piece until, within that world, a story became possible or even inevitable. "It doesn't make sense to ask, 'Where am I going?'" she once told an interviewer, "until you first asked, 'Where am I now?'" That was precisely what she had asked herself when she began writing this book. What kind of place is this? Those were the questions that had got her writing again, after Jack's death. She sat down on a rock and tried to think for a moment. She closed her eyes to blank her mind. She couldn't hear the waves on the beach, or the rain hitting the earth. Nor could she hear David start his pickup outside Gerdie and begin the short drive up the road. Alice only heard him a minute or so later, as the vehicle stopped. She opened her eyes as David got out of the pickup and slammed the door. She watched as he stepped over the wire, then began striding down the field in his bowler suit towards her. "Aye, aye," he shouted from 30 yards away. "Do's meditating, I see." "Something like that," Alice called back, smiling. "Well, dinna get up. I winna bother thee for lang." "So what can I do you for?" she asked. "Or is this a social call?" "No, I normally do me socialising out of the rain," David said. "But I saw thee and I thought I might just hae something that would interest thee. For the book, like. And I didn't want to forget." Alice wasn't entirely sure what David or her other neighbours thought about her writing, or about the book itself, so she was pleased and relieved to hear David's offer. "Well, do ken some clearing out Maggie's house noo, for Sandy to move into, hopefully. She's left to hunt a few things that might be of interest to thee. Things that she wrote, I mean. What kind of things? Diaries, journals, that kind of thing. There's letters and so on that she hid fae their folk, but that's probably nae use to thee. But she wrote a lot, it seems. I'd love to have a look through sometime, as long as you don't think it's too personal. Nah, I'm haid a pity look, and it doesna seem to be like that. More about the weather and work is about hersel, I think. Well, that sounds like it might be useful. Do you want me to come and pick them up? No, I'll drop them off at the house sometime. He turned and looked down the valley, his eyes following the burn towards the wedge of dark sea beyond. Well, I'll let thee get back to the research. I'm needing to research me dinner, I think. Thanks, David, she smiled. Thanks for thinking of me. When Maggie died, Alice tried not to be affected. After all, they had not been friends, not even close, so the great welling of grief inside her at the thought of Maggie seemed somehow insincere, somehow dishonest. But grief is an untamed thing, and it rose, still, at unexpected moments. Jack was 35 when he was diagnosed, not long after they had started trying for a baby. It's now or never, she remembered saying, her uncertainty at the thought of motherhood finally overcome by his enthusiasm and her age. Now or never. For almost 3 years they lived with the disease between them, first with hope. The statistics and his youth were on their side, and then without. By the time he was diagnosed, the cancer had already spread to his lymph nodes and was on its way to his liver. He was one of the unlucky ones, the consultant said, when their fears were finally confirmed. When someone you love is going to die, when you know they're going to die and there is nothing you can do to stop it, life splits. Half of you continues as if everything were normal. You get up in the morning, eat breakfast, brush your teeth. You do your work, see friends, watch television, go to sleep. You function. The other half, though, is always looking forward. It sees beyond the dying to the date. It anticipates the absence that is to come. And yet, somewhere there, between those two halves, the automaton and the seer, you must continue to love and to care for the one who is not gone yet, who is still there, temporary, but real. Alice lived like that for more than 2 years, and she did so as well as could be expected by anyone looking in from the outside. She sat with him for several hours, until he was gone. The nurse came and touched her on the shoulder. She stood and let go of his hand and went through to the waiting room, where a television was switched on in the corner, silent, showing fire engines and ambulances and smoke and wounded people. She looked at the screen for a long time, struggling to understand what was happening there, to separate it from what was happening here. She read the ticker tape of updates as it scrolled, describing the attacks in Norway. She had a feeling then that she was entirely still, and that the world was galloping around her, fixed in its trajectory, and yet spinning with a kind of madness, like a roller coaster out of control, running faster and faster on its rails. She, Alice, was at its centre, utterly powerless, and yet somehow the purpose of it all, as if the spinning, wild, crazy turning of the world were a performance put on for her alone. Jamie looked up from the sofa and scowled at Terry, then looked back at his phone. The Wi-Fi here is shit. Aye, that's right it is. And that's a good reason not to sit around all day looking at a screen. Jamie huffed, and raised himself to his feet as though the effort required were a chore, for which he could scarcely muster the energy. "Where are we going?" "Just to the beach, okay? We won't be lang, I promise." Terry didn't really want to go to the beach any more than Jamie, but he needed to do something. His head was fogged and throbbing, and a few minutes outside might just relieve the pressure. The waves would clear things up, wash away the hangover. Louise, his wife, had dropped their son off first thing this morning, an hour earlier than he'd expected, though that was his fault rather than hers. He had been awake, but only just. Jamie had hardly said a word so far. He had lain out on the sofa with his phone. Terry had been at this house for 7 months now, since Louise finally threw him out. Or at least it seemed final this time. There had been warnings before, plenty of them, but it had never been this serious. Never this long. He didn't blame her for doing it. Not when he was sober, anyway. He knew that these visits were Louise's choice, not Jamie's. He knew, or at least he guessed, that Jamie probably begged to be allowed to stay in tune. Terry didn't look behind him. He knew Jamie would be dragging his trainers along the road, miserable and indignant. He followed the road down to Gerdie, then along the track that laid out towards the beach. The pair of them, father and son, scrunched over the pebbles towards the water. At the end of the beach, both of them paused. Terry's head was still throbbing, but he felt a little better besides that. He turned to the water. He looked down at his feet then, for a flat stone to skim, but they were not easy to find on this beach. He turned like a gull, hunting the tide line, then picked up two that might just work. The first bounced a couple of times, then plunged into a wave. The second didn't even manage that. He flung it, triggered a painful thump in his head, and the stone landed in the water with a plop. Jamie laughed. "You're shit at that." "Yeah, I am. But I'm better as tea." "No, you're no." The boy leaned down and grabbed the slim, awkwardly shaped rock, then turned his body sideways. He threw it hard, just over the top of the nearest wave, and it bounced. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, then shuddered in a series of tiny hops that brought the total, Jamie insisted, to 9. "Okay, yeah, do's better as me." "Don't you want to try again?" "Yeah, okay. Best of 5 then." Terry resumed his search for stones, leaning down and grabbing 3 more likely ones at the edge of the beach, smooth in the hand. He turned himself side on, drew his arm back with the first stone, then, bang! A sloppy smack against his face. A great lump of gritty seaweed slithered from his head to the ground. He looked over at Jamie, who was bent double with laughter. He let his anger slide away until he, too, was creased over. As the kettle came to a boil, a ringing noise made David lift his head from the food. He looked at Mary, and then at the phone on the wall, his mouth too full to ask. "It's your phone," Mary laughed, reaching into the pocket of his fleece, which he'd hung around the back of a chair. She looked at the screen and handed it across the table to him. "Sandy," she said, smiling. David shook his head and swallowed, taking hold of the phone in front of him, looking for the right button. Uh-huh. He pressed it and lifted the handset to his ear. "Hello, boy. How's do?" "I'm okay, thanks, aye." The line was bad. David closed his eyes, concentrating on Sandy's voice. "I just wanted to tell you that I made a decision," Sandy said. "About the house?" "Uh-huh. Well, believe it or no, I'm haid 12 folk on it me asking to buy it. Make a fine holiday hem, een of them telled me." "Oh." Sandy sounded surprised. "Well, are you wanting to sell it?" "No, I dunna. I'm telled thee what I'm wanting. That's no changed." "Okay, that's good. David paused for a second. "Does that mean that thou wants it?" "Aye, I'll give it a try." "Well, that's good news, Sandy boy. I'm awful blithe to hear it." "Yeah, I'm glad too. At least I think so. I'd like to move in as soon as it's ready, if that's possible, afore I can change my mind." "That suits me fine. That'll be ready for thee as soon as I can finish up wi' painting and so on. A couple of weeks, or maybe less if thou's helping." "I'll help," Sandy said. "I'll be along later. We can speak about it then." "Cheers to thee," said David, and took the phone away from his ear, grinning. He looked up at Mary, who was standing by the table watching. "He's wanting to move to Maggie's," David said. "Aye, I got that," Mary nodded slowly. "Well, I hope it works out for him," she said. "I do hope it works out." Sandy moved on the first day of March, a morning studded with hail. He had already shifted a dozen boxes or more, one at a time, from the Red House to Geordie, so on the day itself the job didn't take long. The house felt strange. For days, Sandy struggled to shake off the feeling that it was still someone else's home. By the time the new tenants arrived at the Red House 3 weeks later, he was more settled. His things were back out of their boxes and spread around the house, and that helped. So too did the numerous discussions he'd had with David about the croft. The older man's enthusiasm offered like a gift to him. He laughed sometimes at David's excitement and the efforts he made to keep it in check. From the kitchen window, where he stood washing dishes, Sandy could see up the road towards the Red House. Outside, a white van was parked, from which 2 people were lugging boxes. They were a Shetland couple, David said, from Tallack, a few years younger than Sandy. Sandy was pleased. Some younger people in the valley felt like a relief. Sandy remembered the day that he and Emma had arrived, with 3 suitcases between them. The help they had in those first few days and afterwards came from David and from Mary. They rarely had any problem with Emma's parents. Or at least, Sandy didn't. It was different for Emma, of course. Fond though she was of them, living a few hundred yards down the road meant she would feel crowded, sometimes, by their love. She would complain of the physical proximity of her father and the emotional proximity of her mother. She longed, she said, for a bit more distance. But though at times Emma found it claustrophobic, she didn't lose sight of the fact that her claustrophobia was a luxury. Sandy's parents would not allow her to forget, she told him. His father, though only half an hour away, might as well have been in Peru. He came to visit just a few times a year, and then only when he was specifically invited, which happened rarely. Sandy's mother, Liz, had left when he was 7. She didn't explain what was happening. His father was out, with no idea of what was going on back home. When she'd finished packing, she drove Sandy to a friend's house, left him there, then drove away, catching the ferry south that night. He didn't see her again for almost a year. In the first few weeks after the disappearance, Sandy might as well have been entirely alone. His mother was gone, somewhere, but his father, too, had retreated, still visible but absent nonetheless. Several times, Sandy went in search of him. Hungry and uncertain after meals had failed to materialize, he would find him curled up on the bed he had previously shared. There were never any tears that he saw, just a gaping silence that spread through the room and the house like a disease. Neither his mother nor his father ever fully returned. She did not come back to Shetland. She sent birthday cards most years, and Christmas presents sometimes, but he saw her only rarely. Jim, in turn, seemed to loosen his grip on everything that had once been important to him. For the young boy observing, it was as though his father had evaluated the world, found it wanting, and then turned his back on it, preferring instead to concentrate on things that demanded little or nothing of him emotionally, his work and the television. Sandy saw judgment. He felt judged. He could no longer engage his father's attention as he once had, and so he came to feel himself to be a disappointment. A disappointment so great he had caused his mother to abandon him and his father to shrink like a hermit crab into the hard shell of his own loneliness. As he grew older, though, Sandy came to understand it differently. Emma ultimately forced him to do so. It wasn't disappointment his father felt, she told him. It was fear. He was terrified of losing everything he had, so he'd convinced himself he had nothing to lose. The result was the same, but it was easier for Sandy to swallow. Bitterness melted into pity. His father was not a judgmental man, except perhaps of himself. He was just pathetic and distorted by grief. He wondered now why Emma had failed to see that he was suffering from the same affliction. In the 22 years she'd been gone, Sandy had seen his mother only a dozen times or so, for a total of a month or even less. He went to stay with her once when he was 16. She was living in London at the time and had decided they should start again. He remembered her from that trip as someone simultaneously clingy and remote. She tried to be his friend, asked him questions about girls, about ambitions, but she didn't want to know anything about home or about his father. She introduced Sandy to her friends, some of whom seemed to be learning for the first time that she was a mother. She showed him off like a handbag or a puppy, then ignored him. The trip was supposed to last a fortnight, but he asked to go home after just a week. He thought then that he knew who he was, knew the kind of life he wanted to lead. Freedom was the absence of drama, of anxiety. He'd had enough of that in his childhood, wanted no more of it. So he made himself impervious to the fractured world. He made himself solid and whole, or at least he thought so. Emma challenged that thought. She was the first person with whom he'd ever felt a desire, a need, to peel away some of the protective layers around himself. How or why that happened had never been entirely clear. Coming north again, after 2 years together, was a risk for them both. Some of their friends had already returned to the islands to settle and start families, and Emma had felt that pull, more so than he ever did. Had she wanted to live in Tallack or anywhere else in Shetland for that matter, he might have resisted. He might have said no. But the valley was different. The valley made a kind of sense. Here, he'd felt insulated from the fractured world that once had seemed so threatening. Here, he'd felt absorbed by the place without being destroyed by it. For most of his life, Sandy had fought to avoid becoming his father. He fought against that diminishment of self that comes when one loses what one cannot afford to lose. In pushing Emma away, he realized he might already have lost that battle. He might already be diminished. Sandy paused at the door of the Raid House a moment before knocking. The curtains were closed in the living room, but the lights were on, and he could hear footsteps coming from there towards the hallway. He stepped back and smiled. "Hello?" the man in the doorway said. "Aye, I'm Sandy, for doon the rod. I just wanted to say hello, really, and welcome, and to bring you this, a housewarming present. He handed the card and bottle over, then stepped back again, ready to leave if necessary. Will you come in for a drink, since you've so kindly provided some? Ryan lifted the bottle and smiled. We haven't got that far yet. Come in and sit down, he said. I'll go and get some glasses. Sandy sat in a scarlet armchair that matched the scarlet sofa. He looked around the room, so familiar, and yet entirely changed. It was still mostly empty. There were, as yet, no pictures on the wall, no books on the shelves, no ornaments or personal touches of any kind. The stairs creaked, the top two had always been noisy, and the pad of socked feet descended to the hall. The door opened. Hello, I'm Jo, the young woman said, and she smiled. All three of them sat down then. Sandy back in the armchair, Ryan and Jo on the sofa. Jo poured the wine. So, how long have you lived here then? Jo turned and looked at Sandy. You were in this house before the other one, weren't you? Yes. I moved here just over 3 years ago with Emma, David and Mary's daughter. But she left last year. I moved a few weeks back. Ryan looked up, one eyebrow raised. Is that why you moved out then? But weird. Renting for the ex's parents. I'm still renting from them, actually, Sandy smiled. David owns the house at the end of the road as well. Uh-huh. Quite the property tycoon he is, then. I'm not sure he would look at it that way, Sandy laughed. He's certainly no making a fortune off me. Jo looked at him, nodding as he spoke. They do seem like lovely people, she said. We're lucky to have found this place. You certainly are, said Sandy. Fuck, we're queuing halfway for Lerwick to get this house, according to David. You two must be special. Why did he turn them down? Asked Ryan. He wanted young folk, said Sandy. He's hoping you'll stay for a while, become part of the community, that kind of thing. Well, that's ironic, said Ryan. How do you mean? Asked Sandy. Ryan took another gulp of wine, then poured more from the bottle into his glass. Well, he's certainly helping us out, but maybe knowing the way he thinks he is. I hear flat in town. 3 bedrooms, like. I inherited it from me nan, and we lived there for a year or so, but we figured we could rent it out and get somewhere cheaper, make some money. When we heard we'd got this place, we advertised ours online and had the paperwork signed the next day. We're getting 3 times as much for it as we're paying in rent here every month. So, if we stick it out here for a couple of years, he shrugged, we'll be doing pretty well. Sandy didn't smile, but tried not to look shocked. It was a perfectly logical situation, after all, certainly from their side. Well, that sounds like a good deal, he said. But I wouldn't tell David about it if I were you. He walked towards the door, and Jo and Ryan stood up and followed him. Outside, he turned around and smiled. It's very nice to hae some new folk here. Liven the place up a little. Thank you, said Jo. Thanks for coming along, and for the wine. It's very nice to meet you. Aye, good to meet you. And I'm sure we'll see you again soon, said Ryan, though Sandy barely heard those words, for Jo's were still shimmering inside him, like a deep vibration that ran through his nerves and into his guts. He stepped away, raising his hand in a farewell gesture. Cheers, he shouted, turning his back on the house. He heard the door close, but felt the presence of Jo still behind him. Stepping out onto the road and down towards his house, the thought of her seemed, to him, like a kind of intrusion, unwelcome and yet irresistible. He reached the end of the road, exhausted, and went upstairs to bed, pausing only once to look from the window towards the lights that shone in the red house, where Ryan and Jo now lived. Since David brought Maggie's boxes around to the house more than a month ago, they had lain unopened in the spare room. Alice was busy with other things, but last night, laying awake, she had thought of them. She picked one of the boxes and peeled back the lid. Inside were stacks of letters in envelopes, some of them strapped together with elastic bands. It's funny, Alice thought, a few hours later, as she lay belly down on the sheepskin rug in her study, a sheaf of letters open in front of her. It's funny what people decide to record. Most of them began with a bland note of gratitude. Thank you for your letter. Thanks for your kind words. Followed invariably by an account of recent weather conditions, often in considerable detail. Alice picked up the next letter, written 2 weeks later. More of the same. Sandy stood beside the fence, just watching for now. The yow was turning in circles, as though trying to investigate her back end to understand where the pain was coming from and why. She was uncomfortable, that was obvious, but she wasn't yet in trouble. Sandy had learned not to call for help too early. Twice already he'd rung David in a panic, worried that the sheep was needing help, and both times he'd been wrong. "Nothing needs doing here," David had said. "She'll sort herself out, leave her to it." Sandy's thoughts drifted from the animal in front of him, back to those of the past few weeks. He watched the yow, now lying awkwardly on her side, and waited to see how the birth would progress. Is she okay? He hadn't noticed Jo come up alongside him, so he jumped when she spoke. Then, as he turned to her, he felt a crick in the centre of himself. It was a strange sensation, like when you turn your back the wrong way, feel something give, something amiss. "She's okay," he said, turning back to the field and the expectant mother. "I worry too much. I'm a first-time parent," he said. "Unlike her." Jo smiled. "I can understand that. I don't think I could do it, you know. I'd never be able to sleep for worrying about them." "Who says I can sleep?" Both of them were silent for a moment, standing, watching. For the past month, Sandy had been fighting and failing to keep Jo from his mind. It was a manifestation of his loneliness. Jo was a surrogate for Emma, or something like that. But that didn't make it go away. He had hardly seen Jo for the fortnight after that first meeting at the Red House. But when David and Mary invited him for dinner one night in early April, he found, to his horror and delight, that Jo and Ryan had been invited too. The evening was good. Ryan had irritated Sandy a little, but mostly his attention had been elsewhere. He wondered on several occasions whether Ryan was deliberately trying to goad David, talking about money and about crofting in a way that seemed too close to teasing. But when Sandy quizzed him about it later, David had seemed oblivious. He liked Ryan. "He's a tunny," he said, "but he means well." Sandy was far from certain that Ryan did mean well. But just as he found his loneliness tangled up with his desire for Jo, he found that desire equally tangled with his dislike for Ryan. The first time they were alone together 2 days after, he had been stepping out of Billy's shop in Treswick. He paused, waiting. "Hello, Sandy," she called, walking past them as he stood unmoving in the car park. He felt paralysed. So intense and convoluted were his feelings then, it seemed impossible that she wouldn't notice. Sitting down in his car outside the shop, he leaned forward and rested his forehead against the steering wheel, his heart gasping. He closed his eyes and dragged air into his lungs. He tried to untether himself from the mess inside. He breathed quietly until a tap against the window brought him back, upright and awake. He wound down the glass. "Are you okay?" Jo asked. "Is your car not working?" He smiled, weakly, trying not to seem shocked or deranged. "No, I'm fine," he said. "I'm just tired, and I had to make a phone call. Don't worry." "Oh, you can get a signal here, can you? I get nothing." Joe turned to leave. "Well, I'll see you soon, I hope." She walked back towards her own car. He waited until she'd pulled away before he started the engine and drove away in the wrong direction for a mile to give her time to get to the house. "What are you thinking about?" Joe asked after a long silence. He turned to look at her and tried to explain it with a smile. "I'm thinking about that yow, I suppose." "No, you're not. What's to think about? You can see how she is." "Well, maybe I wasn't thinking then. Maybe I was just looking." "You just seemed like you were thinking about something important. You were frowning." "Sorry. That's just me face. It's a frowny one." "Do you always joke to try and avoid talking?" "You always ask difficult questions." "I ask difficult questions when I want to know the answer. If I don't ask, I'll never know." "And why do you want the cane?" He was trying to avoid sounding flirtatious, but he couldn't find the right tone. "Well, we're neighbours. You seem interesting, but I know very little about you. Maybe I'm being nosy, but I'm just trying to be direct. I'm asking you instead of asking someone else. I hoped you'd be okay with that. I'm sorry." "No, it's okay. But I'm not sure I'm all that interesting. I do think about sheep quite a lot. At least this year I do." "But you chose that, didn't you? You must have wanted to think about them." "I'm not sure if wanting had anything to do with it. I'm not sure what I want, exactly. I used to cane, but no, I don't." "What do you mean by that?" Joe asked. "I guess some days I feel like I've just found myself here. Like I've been dragged here on some kind of current. Other people have made the choices. I've just gone along with them." "So you're not happy then?" "No, I wouldn't say that. I am happy. Most of the time, anyway. It's no ideal taking on the craft on my own when there's so much I had to learn and do. But it's all right. I'd still be on my own whatever I was doing. This is as good a place to be alone as any." "But you don't want to be alone, do you?" "Not forever, no. But I'm better company as some folk," he smiled. "I'm not desperate yet." Part of him flinched, though he wasn't sure if he flinched at the lie itself or at the fear of being disbelieved. Part of him wanted to be disbelieved. "So are you happy here?" he asked. "Yes, I think so." She offered a hesitant smile. "It suits me. More than the tune, I reckon. Ryan is not so sure about it, but that's to be expected, I suppose. He's never lived in the country before." "Are you secretly hoping you won't have to move back to Dun?" "Well, we'll see. If we save up some money and sell the flat, we can buy a house anywhere, really. If we decide we like it out here, we can look for somewhere nearby. And if we don't, there'll be somewhere in Tune." "And what if one of you wants to stay and one of you wants to go?" It was a stupid question. He regretted it as soon as the words left his mouth. "I guess we'll just have to cross that bridge when we come to it. I'm probably less fussy than he is. I can manage wherever I am, near enough." Neither of them said anything for a moment. A car came down the road towards them. Mary was driving. She stopped alongside Sandy and Joe and rolled down the window. Sandy leaned over. "David's been trying to call you," said Mary. "Oh, sorry, I left my phone inside. What's up?" "He's got a yow that's needing a hand, and he thought you'd want to come and help out. I thought you'd have better things to do, but he insisted I come down and check. It's entirely up to you." "No, of course, I'll come and help. I was just watching one of my own, he said. But she seems to be doing okay. Right, said Mary. You can come back up the road with me then. If you wait, he'll likely hear that sorted. OK, yeah, I'll come with you. Sandy turned to Joe. I'm sorry to rush off and abandon you, he said. I need to go and help. Well, I need to go and learn. That's OK, Joe answered. You go on. Nice to see you, Mary, she added. Yes, you too, said Mary, as Sandy jumped into the passenger seat. He closed the door and held up his hand to Joe in a wave. She waved back as Mary turned the car at the end of the road, then drove back towards Kettlestar. Sandy's heart pitching like a lifeboat in a storm. The knock came just after 8 in the evening. Sandy paused. He recognised Joe through the frosted glass, and his head, again, flooded. Hello again, he said. Come in, how's do? Joe stepped past him into the narrow hallway, and he held his breath. Go on through, he said, closing the door behind her. Are you wanting tea or anything? No, I'm fine, Joe said. I won't keep you long. She took a seat in the far corner of the room, beside the window. Well, he said, where did we get to before Mary cut was off? Joe laughed. I think I was telling you how happy we are here. Which was almost true. She sat back. We are doing okay, you know. Ryan does plenty of complaining. But that's just Ryan. He's not happy unless he has something to complain about. She was quiet then. Are you all right? Sandy asked. I'm okay, yes, I'm fine. Sorry. I didn't come here to complain. You can complain how you like, said Sandy. Sucker for punishment, are you? Well, I couldn't do it to you. Once I started, I might not be able to stop. Sandy longed for her to start, but he knew that she wouldn't. Well, if you've not come here to complain, what did you come for? The question could have been put better. I came to invite you over. We've decided to have a housewarming. That sounds excellent, he replied. When were you thinking? Next Saturday. Would that suit you? Sandy nodded. Who have you signed up so far? I'm still to speak to Terry next door. We haven't really met him properly yet. I canna think he'll have plans. He hardly leaves the house at the moment. He's a fine enough guy most of the time. Just a bit lonely. Like you then, Joe laughed again. Aye, just like me. Well, we can keep both of you lonely old men company for a night in that case. That's very charitable of you. It's not charitable, Sandy, Joe smiled. It's something different from that. Hello, come in, said Joe, emerging from the living room. She leaned forward and hugged Mary, then David, then led them through to the kitchen. What would you like to drink? You're the first here, but I'm sure others will be along soon. Don't worry, Mary said. A glass of wine will be perfect. David will have himself a beer. Come and let's sit down. By the time everyone had arrived, Joe already seemed a little drunk. As much on adrenaline and anxiety perhaps as on white wine, but drunk nonetheless. David too was drinking faster than usual, and Terry had obviously had plenty before he even left his house. Alcohol made Mary nervous. Terry's drunkenness seemed to exaggerate parts of himself he otherwise suppressed. He would throw snide remarks into conversations the way a child might hurl themselves at a flock of pigeons. Tonight, he appeared more himself, gentler, when he arrived, but he still made Mary uneasy. Lovely to see you, Terry, she said. How have you been? Oh, the Canes. Trying my best not to think about the misery of my existence. Joe said, Hi, Alice. Have a seat. Join us. Alice pulled in another chair and sat down. She wore a smile that looked, to Mary, too much for the occasion, like ornamentation or protection. But perhaps she was nervous too. "How are you, Alice? How's things?" "Oh, I'm grand, thanks, yes. Busy as always, but that's my own fault." "How's the getting on with Maggie's things? Any use to thee?" "I'm guessing no." David leaned forward to speak. "Most of it is probably not much use, I suppose. She wrote about the weather a lot. But there's some of it that I might be able to do something with. I'm just not sure what exactly." "There's no been through it yet, is there?" "Pretty much, yes." "Christ, that's dedication. I read a few pages and that was enough for me." Alice laughed. "Yeah. Some of it was a bit dull." "They can say that again." "Was she like that in person, though?" Alice asked. "Not dull, I mean, but, you know, I'm interested to find out what she was like." David hesitated. "Well, I dunna ken what to say, really. She wasna dull, no. She was fine company, most of the time. She was funny. She told a lot of stories about the valley. Me parents, her parents. Other folk that used to bide around here." "What else can you tell me about her?" "I dunna ken, really. She was just normal." David laughed. "Living here," said Ryan, leaning in close. "Do you not find it kinda restrictive or something?" Sandy could smell the beer on his breath, could feel the clammy warmth of it on his face. He shifted his feet to make some distance. "In what way?" "Ach, the kinds. It's like they has to live by strict rules to fit in. Like they has to conform." Sandy shrugged. "I dunna feel like I'm conforming. I'm just..." He shrugged again. "It's not as simple as that." "So, does they feel as free here as they did afore then, in the city?" Sandy shrugged again. He wasn't deliberately trying to annoy Ryan, but the question seemed pointless somehow. He sighed and made more effort to answer. "I dunna think I felt free like that in the city," he said. "No, really." Ryan turned to Terry then, who'd said nothing throughout the exchange. "Well, what about thee? Is thou happy?" "Look at me. What does thou think?" He took a swig from his can. "But I'm no sure that I rate happiness as highly as thee." "You's a weird bastard, Terry." "I try me best." They all laughed then, relieved that Terry had allowed them that. "And what about free?" Ryan went on. "Does thou feel free here?" Terry looked away and drank again. He seemed to wince as he considered his answer. "Well, my parents were married when they were 18. That's probably young, I think. They grew up together, they lived together. They were hardly ever apart. I dunna think they were ever free. Not in the way thou means, but I dunna think either of them would have ever felt unfree. I think they found their freedom within the boundaries they chose. Some people can do that. They need to see the limits of their freedom in order to feel free. But..." There he paused, as if he'd lost his train of thought. "Maybe it's about choice. They chooses the boundaries and who lives within them." "That sounds great," said Ryan. "But it's definitely bollocks." "Aye, it might be," Terry agreed. "And I certainly dinna feel free, so what would I ken?" "No, I think you could be right," Sandy said, as much to rebalance the conversation against Ryan as to prolong it. "Look at David." He lowered his voice, nodding across the room. "He hardly ever even leaves the valley, but he doesn't seem restricted to me. And I dunna think I ken a happier person as David." "I didn't say anything about happiness," Terry interjected. "The twa things aren't the same. They can be free and miserable, or they can be a happy slave." "So why would you want to be free if it didn't make you happy?" "There's got to aim for something." Terry was swaying now, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Sandy felt protective then, wishing to save Terry the embarrassment into which he seemed determined to dive. "Fancy something to eat, Terry?" Sandy asked. "I'm hungry again." A bit of cake, he figured, might just be enough to keep Terry conscious. "Aye," Terry said. "Maybe some of yon cocktail sausages." "I'll see what I can find. Give me a minute," said Sandy. He stepped away from the two men and into the hallway, then carried on towards the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, he saw Jo standing in the corner of the room beside the oven. She pulled her sleeve over her fist as he came in, wiping her eyes and sniffing. He paused, then pushed the door closed behind him. "Sorry," Jo said. "For what?" Sandy replied. "For being a pathetic host who comes to cry in the kitchen." She tried to gather a smile together. "Well, you've been an excellent host so far. Plus, it's your party, so you can cry if you want to. Is there anything I can do, rather than stand here asking questions?" "No, not really. I feel happy, really, with everyone around. It's amazing. I think maybe it's just reminding me that I'm not always this happy. It's reminding me what's left once you lot go." She looked up at him, tightening her lips. "Ryan, you mean?" Sandy lowered his voice. "Yes, Ryan. Or else, no. I shouldn't say that. I don't mean... Oh, I don't know. Life is complicated, that's all. People are complicated." "Well, that's certainly true." Sandy longed to be having this conversation anywhere else but there, any other time than then. "We're just very different, you know. That was part of the attraction to begin with. The things I felt were inadequate about me were things that were not in him." "There's nothing inadequate about you," Sandy said. Jo looked at him with a half sneer. She was even more drunk than he'd thought, and her reply sounded both cruel and slurred. "You don't even know me, Sandy," she said. "You might imagine you do, but that's just wishful thinking. I'm probably nothing like you think I am." He didn't respond, just waited for her to continue as he flinched inside. "Anyway, he's not exactly... He's not what I... Oh, I don't know. I shouldn't be telling you any of this." "Well, don't worry. You haven't told me anything so far." Jo sighed, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, Sandy." "What for?" "For what I just said about you." "You don't have to apologise. I don't know you. I just want to." "You're kind." "Why?" "For wanting to know you. That's an entirely selfish desire. There's nothing to do with kindness." "Well, it seems like it from here. You're nice." "Thank you, Sandy." "No need to thank me. I just wanted a piece of cake and you got in the way." Jo laughed then. "No, really. Thank you." She looked up at him, her mouth cocked as though she might laugh again, but she didn't laugh. Sandy felt a tightness in his chest, as if all his organs had grown suddenly too large for the space in which they were held. He moved towards Jo, hoping she would speak again, fill the silence her words had opened up between them. "We should go back through, Jo," he said, almost against his will. "Terry will be getting impatient. I promised to get him some food. He's not in the best state." "No. Well, nor am I. We can go through in a minute. I'm just wanting a quick cuddle, if that's okay. I'll feel a lot better after that if you can manage." Sandy nodded. "Yes, I can manage that," he said, and leaned forward. Jo's arms around his shoulders made his skin clench and shiver all the way down to his stomach. She pulled him closer, then turned her head and rested it on his shoulder. He held her body against his and tipped his own head just a little so it leaned on hers. He sighed, His fingers shifted over her dress, rubbing her back. They stood together like that, barely moving for several minutes. Neither of them spoke. Sandy wondered if Joe might be asleep. Her breath whispered against his neck, gentle as cotton grass. He felt, beyond the welling of relief and desire inside him, a clench of terror too. Neither of them was going to move, he realised. Neither of them would release the other until something made them do so. He waited for that something to happen. Fear and elation colliding inside him in a toxic, intoxicating brew. When the door finally opened, it was Joe who jumped first, pulling her head up off Sandy's shoulder and releasing her hands from behind his back. But not quickly enough. Sandy moved more slowly, resigned as he already was to being caught doing something that was little more than nothing, but which looked much worse. He didn't see Mary at all. He didn't turn around. He only heard her voice. "Oh, sorry," she said, flustered. Then the door closed again, and he heard her walk away. Joe and Sandy stood apart now, looking at each other. "Well, it could have been worse," he said. "But it's still bad. I'm sorry. You need to go back through. She won't tell anyone, will she?" "Well, she won't tell Ryan. Don't worry about that." Joe seemed almost to shrink. Her arms drew inward around her chest, her head lowered. "That was stupid. I'm so drunk. Sorry. Go back through now, please." Sandy reached a hand out to touch Joe's shoulder, but she pulled herself away. "Go," she hissed. It wasn't clear if he was already awake before the banging started, or if it was the banging that woke him. At first it was hard to distinguish whether the noise was in fact separable from the pounding in his skull, so closely entwined were sound and pain. The banging was knocking, his front door, and at the moment of that connection, the image of a fist upon the glass. Last night replayed again. The hug. Joe. Mary. Ryan. As he reached the bottom step and opened the door into the living room, he prepared himself for the worst, and frankly, the pain in his head was then so great that the thought of being punched was not nearly so worrying as it might otherwise have been. He looked up along the hall towards the glass door of the porch and saw the figure standing on the other side. He was expecting Ryan. He was not expecting his mother. Sandy looked at her, the door held open in his hand. It had been almost 4 years since he'd last seen her, and she'd aged. "Are you not going to let me in?" Sandy led the way to the living room and took a seat in the armchair. He made no attempt to speak. "This is a lovely house," she said after a few minutes. "And a beautiful place. Do you own it?" "No, I rent the croft for Emma's feather." "You're a crofter now? Seriously?" Sandy didn't rise to the question, just nodded. "And Emma? How is she?" His mother had met Emma only once, when the three of them got together in a cafe near Trafalgar Square. Emma had suggested the meeting. Sandy had gone along with it. "She moved south at the end of last year, and I've not seen her since then." "Oh, I'm sorry." "It's fine. It was mutual, pretty much." Sandy closed his eyes, pressing his fingers to his lidded eyeballs now and then, trying to release some of the pressure from inside his head. "Mum, why are you here?" His mother looked at him. "Does there have to be a reason?" "We've not seen each other in 4 years. I've not even heard for you in the past 2 years aside for a Christmas card, so, yeah, there has to be a reason." "Well," she paused. Trevor threw me out last month. Trevor? Who is Trevor? He was my boyfriend. And why did he do that? I don't really want to go into it. I wondered if I could stay with you for a bit, until I figure things out. Are you serious? It won't be for long. If I decide to go south again, I'll be gone soon, and if I decide to stay, then I'll find my own place. Sandy stared at his mother, the woman who had walked out on his father and him 22 years earlier, the woman whose absence had shaped him, shaped every edge of him, whose indifference had cut him time and time again, and whose love he still craved, unwillingly. Sandy looked at her, and he wanted more than anything to shout, "No! Just leave and don't ever come back." But that wasn't what he said. Since the day Sandy's mother arrived, the two of them had barely communicated, other than at mealtimes. Sandy cooked for the first couple of days, then Liz took over. They didn't discuss it. She just made it her business to have something ready on the stove by the time he came home. He assumed that his mother's presence would be short-lived, and that she would disappear as suddenly as she had appeared, and he refused to get used to her being there. Each day, as he returned home and opened the door, he expected to be met with silence, but each day the sound of another person greeted him as he entered. Liz's arrival had forced son and mother into a cage whose bars were built of hurt and obligations. They faced each other off across this space, performing a silent balancing act, a convoluted manoeuvre, directed by disappointment and by the urge towards love. Sandy jabbed at her when he could, reminding Liz of her failures and feeling guilty each time he did so, but not guilty enough to stop. Liz, in turn, was doing her best to ignore these digs, or at least it seemed so. She flinched sometimes when he spoke curtly to her, but she didn't defend herself. He guessed she must have been truly desperate to have come running to him for help. But since that first brief conversation on the morning she arrived, he had never asked for more details. He wanted her to think it didn't matter to him whether she stayed or went. He wanted to punish her with indifference, either genuine or manufactured. Most of all, though, he wanted to hide from his mother the insuppressible sense of relief he felt each evening to find she had not yet gone away. David stood with his hands in his bowler suit pockets, looking at the pool of muddy water in the beach park behind Gerdie. He didn't turn around when he heard the gate open, then close again. He just kept looking until Sandy was standing beside him. "Aye, aye, boy." David gave a sideways nod and a grimace. "Is thou ready to get clarity today?" Sandy laughed. "Aye, I'm looking forward to it. So what's the plan?" David had explained the problem on the phone the night before. The water that had lain in this park for the past 6 months was not, as he'd thought, a simple drainage problem. It had been a wet winter, all right. It had rained almost every day for the whole month of February, and early spring hadn't been much better. But it had been mostly dry for 3 weeks now, and the pool was still growing. "It's filling up for some way, and we need to figure out where," David had said. "If we don't sort it out now, they'll be floating away for long." "OK. And where do you think the water's coming from?" "Well, if we're lucky, it'll be something simple. There's a pipe that runs for the end of the ditch by the road. It could easy be that pipe that's broken, in which case we just had to find the brack and repair it." The two men walked around the park more or less at random, lifting their feet high with each step to try to avoid getting stuck or falling over. Neither of them was entirely sure what exactly they were hunting for. Some sign or clue, perhaps, as to the origin of this quagmire. "Right, it's drier up here," said David, standing on a piece of higher ground close to the house, "and the wheat starts just below. I'm pretty certain that water runs downhill rather as uphill. So, if we dig a trench roughly along this contour, Well, hopefully find something. Like what? Like a pipe? And so they began digging, a line of about 10 metres just above where the mud began. They dug down a foot or so and turned the turfs over. They found nothing. When 5 o'clock came, the park was criss-crossed with ditches and channels of various depths, some dry, some saturated, and both David and Sandy were leaning on their spades, exhausted, frustrated, but reluctant to give up. "It shouldn't be this bloody difficult," Sandy said. "No, it certainly shouldn't. But I'm not sure me back'll let me carry on today. Maybe we should see if we canna get some more help the morn, or next weekend." "More help? Like what?" "Like Terry, I suppose. Or Ryan." "Ryan?" Sandy said. "Aye, that'll be right. What? He's a fine young fellow. Not that impractical, maybe, but neither was thou when thou first came." "A fine fellow? Ryan?" "Aye, well, he certainly got default." "What does thou mean by that?" "Oh, nothing." "Well, thou meant something." Sandy paused. "He's cheating thee." "Did you ken that?" "Well, sort o' anyway. Making out they're in need so they can get the house for you for cheap. He has a big house in town he's renting out. He's making a fortune for thee." David looked straight at Sandy. "Is yon true?" "Aye, he tell't me himself." David went back to digging. He felt a rush of anger, as if he'd just been humiliated, by Sandy as well as by Ryan. Sandy stabbed his spade down into the ditch he'd been digging, as though struck by that same rush of anger. Then he paused. He lifted the blade and pressed down again, more gently this time. He kneeled. David looked over, noticing the change as Sandy began clawing at the mud with his fingers, staring intently at the ground beneath his feet. "Yes!" he shouted, looking up at David. "I'm fun a pipe!" "Will you help me get this chest of drawers in from the car?" Jo shouted, leaning her head in through to the hallway from the front door. She waited a few seconds, then went back to the open boot and tried to lift the chest out. If she manoeuvred the legs upward, then slid the back over the edge of the car, it should tilt smoothly down onto the driveway. But she was struggling. "Come on, Ryan," she called. He appeared in the doorway in a pair of football shorts and a t-shirt, a half-eaten apple in his hand. "Why do we need a chest of drawers?" he asked, not moving from the threshold. "We're already got him." Jo continued to struggle with the chest. Ryan padded out in his sock feet. "Careful," he said. "You'll damage it." He eased the chest back inside the boot, then adjusted the angle. Between the two of them, it came out easily. "It's fine," he said. "Where's it going?" "At the top of the stairs on the landing." I was hoping they wouldn't have said that." "Sorry, but that's where it's going." "Aye, okay." Ryan took one end, shuffling backwards, his head swivelled as far round as it would go, while Jo took the other. He edged himself through the doorway, his elbows brushing the jambs, and she followed, trying not to trip. Once inside, she kicked the door closed behind them, and they began slowly to climb the steps, Ryan first, Jo following. Halfway up, he grinned and stopped. He put his end down and let go, then continued up the stairs without a word. "Hey, where are you going? Ryan, come back, I'm going to fall." She wasn't going to fall, and she knew that. The chest was heavy, but she could support it without difficulty. Resting as it was, it didn't take much effort. But she couldn't move. She could feel the weight of it against her hands. If she let go of her end, it would tumble or slide down on top of her. And so she was stuck, immobile, on the stairs. Ryan went into the bathroom. He didn't close the door, but made a big deal of what he was doing. He didn't wash his hands, but returned to the chest, taking his time, then grasped it again. "You are an arsehole." That was all she said. Then they continued up the 7 steps to the top. Joe sat down at the top of the stairs. Ryan returned to the living room, and she could hear the murmur of the television through the closed door. She couldn't face him again just yet. Eventually, Ryan came out of the living room and stepped up to sit beside her. He put his arm around her and squeezed. "Sorry," he said. "I'm a dick sometimes, even when I don't mean to be." Jo leaned her head over onto his shoulder. "Yes, you are. I'll cook tonight. What would you like?" "I'm still not decided what to do about Ryan and Jo. About the house," David said. "Have you made sure it's true yet, what Sandy said?" "No. I don't want to go and speak to him and no hear a response ready if he says it is true. And if I'm no going to do anything about it, well, there's no point in me even asking, is there?" "I suppose not," Mary smiled. Sometimes her husband's logic could be both strange and perfect at once. "I'm no happy, though." "No? It definitely seems cheeky." "Bloody right it's cheeky. I'm charging a pittance for that house. He'll be charging a fortune for hising. They're making a fool of me." "Being generous is not foolish." "But they're exploiting me generosity. I would never have charged so little if I'd kent." "Well, chuck them out if you care that much about it, but don't do it unless you're sure it's the right thing to do." "I'm no sure of anything, that's the problem." Mary, likewise, was unsure. Perhaps it was their attitude that was out of date and out of place. They'd been naive. Ryan had been smart. What had shocked her almost as much, though, was to know it had been Sandy who brought the news. He seemed an inappropriate messenger somehow. She'd thought again about what she'd seen at the party and what it might have meant. She'd thought again about the hug. Things right now were complicated, that's all she knew, and she wanted them to be simple. "I think you should just call him up and ask directly," Mary said. "But I'm going to phone Emma first. Do you want to speak to her once I'm done?" David looked up. His face changed entirely. "Aye, certainly." Hearing Emma's voice allowed Mary to push aside the complications of Ryan, Jo, and Sandy. It made the day seem brighter. "I'm beginning to wish I never gave those things to Alice," said David. "What things, love?" Mary asked. "Maggie's things. She seems obsessed now. She wants to meet up and ask me more questions about her." "Well, why did you give her them then, if you didn't want her to ask anything?" "I didn't think they'd be muckle use. I had a look and it seemed dry as anything." "So you gave them to her because you didn't think she'd be interested?" "Pretty much, aye," he grinned. "Well, it serves you right then, I'd say." "Well, I canna see how she's going to write anything about Maggie. What's there to say?" "I hae no idea. When you meet her, ask her to explain. Then you can decide how much you're wanting to say. Does that sound sensible?" "Aye, maybe so." Come in." Mary stood clear of the door to let Alice through. "David's just at the back, but he's expecting you. Do you want a cup of tea?" "Yes, that'd be lovely, thanks." David came in then, his shirt creased and half untucked. He nodded a hello and looked from Alice to Mary. "Your tea's aside the sink," she said. He nodded again and went out, returning a moment later with a mug and a packet of biscuits. "Right, I'm ready. What's the wanting to ken?" Alice wondered if she ought to have compiled a list of questions, or something solid to begin with at least, and she was glad when Mary excused herself and returned to the kitchen. Well, it's mostly pretty general stuff I'd like to hear from you. I've read all the diaries and so on, but I'd really like to get a better idea of what kind of person Maggie was. David raised his eyebrows as though he'd been asked a particularly tricky question. Well, I dunna ken. He spoke slowly. She had a brawly good memory, that's for sure. She used to tell stories that gied way back. Things that happened afore she was even born. Folk that used to bide about here, she could tell the other connections. She had something to tell about our body. He shook his head. I used to think sometimes I must have heard our stories at one time or another, but then now and again she'd come out with something that I'd never heard. About me father or me mither even. Amazing. There's always stories. I'd have liked to have heard them. So, what exactly is to needing to ken about her? I mean, what exactly is to writing? If I can't that, maybe I could be of mere help. To be honest, I'm still not quite sure. My book is nearly finished now, about the valley, I mean, but I just thought there was something missing from it. I want to get that real human side in there. Alice felt frustrated, as much by her own inability to explain what she was thinking as by David's refusal to understand. What I mean is that, by writing about Maggie, I think I could say something about the community here in the valley. She must have had thoughts, had feelings. She wasn't a robot. No, she wasn't. But what business of thine is Maggie's feelings? Alice stopped and looked at David again. His face was serious, but not angry. I'm not looking for deep secrets or anything. I'm just looking for something human. I don't know what to say. It seems pretty human to me. David leaned forward and looked directly at Alice then. Look, I don't know how to say this exactly. I don't want to offend thee, but it just seems to me I'm no sure thou understands what thou's written about. Alice's mouth fell open, as though his words had fixed themselves to her jaw. Life at Gerdie had become for Sandy a full-time exercise in self-control. It took considerable effort now to avoid arguments and confrontations, and often he did not succeed. What made things worse, though, was that his mother seemed to require no such effort. Almost without fail, she was cheerful and relaxed. When he turned on her, as he often did in those first few weeks, she barely responded. For half his life, he had longed for his mother to take an interest in him, and she never gave him what he wanted. Now, here she was, and he still couldn't get the required response. His anger bounced off her, just as his affection had done years earlier. He knew how to deal with her absence. He wanted her to be gone, but he could not, yet, insist on it. The part of him that still craved her love would not allow it. Are you serious? Sandy gripped the back of the chair and stared at his mother. She was standing in front of the stove, stirring with a wooden spoon. Are you actually serious? Yes, of course I am. Why not? You missed out on having us both around when you were younger, so it seems only fair to try and do something about that now. I've spoken to Jim, and he's happy to come around for dinner sometime. It's just a case of when suits you. Dad's happy to come around. He said that. Well, he said he was willing to give it a try. Sandy turned away from his mother then, and towards the kitchen window. As a teenager, he used to dream of a moment like this, a reconciliation, a truce, a reunion. But that dream was too old to resurrect. It had festered, impossible, for 20 years. Yet now, here, she was ordering him to bring it back to life. He couldn't do it. But nor could he refuse. If Dad wants to come around and visit, he's welcome to do so. He's welcome any time. He kens that. You can invite him, and you can cook for us. I'll be there. That's about as much as I can say. and it's no even a promise. I'll let you ken if I change me mind, which I might do." Liz smiled weakly, or tried to smile. "Might even be fun," she said. "We'll all enjoy it, I promise." Sandy shook his head and walked away into the living room. He lay on the sofa and closed his eyes. Tears swelled beneath his lids, and he clenched them tighter. His chest quivered as he pushed back his hope, his fear, his grief. He took his phone out and wrote a text. "What am I supposed to do about her?" He sent it to Emma. She was the only person who might know what to say. Liz watched their son go and returned to the stew on the stove. She didn't hear him cry. She didn't think him capable of tears. His crankiness, she thought, was a kind of hardness in him. Not a shell or a scab, but a kernel long since formed. She had not been a good mother. She knew that. She had been a bad mother, in fact. There was no point trying to water it down. She had walked away from her responsibilities and abandoned her son. There were moments when she figured she'd have to come back and take her son away. But still, as mediocre a father as he turned out to be, Jim was still a better father than she could ever have been a mother. Until now, anyway. And if she was honest with herself, that was what this whole trip was about. Not making up for missed time. She knew there was nothing she could do to ever make up for the years she'd been gone, and it wasn't worth trying. But now she was older, maybe even wiser. She thought perhaps she could be a mother after all. Trevor throwing her out like that was just the prompt she needed to do something about it. "Sandy, come and eat," she shouted, almost surprising herself. There was no sound at all from the living room. She waited a moment longer, then went through to look. Sandy was lying on his side on the sofa, one hand beneath his head, the other against his chest. He was fast asleep. "Sandy, darling." Liz kneeled down on the floor beside his head. She gazed at him there, and remembered when he was young, 5 or 6. He would come down to the living room at night, an hour or so after he'd been put to bed. "I can't sleep," he'd say, rubbing his eyes like a bad actor pretending to be tired. "Why can't you sleep, Sandy?" Liz would ask. "I don't know. I want to sleep here with you." And so he would lie on the sofa and rest his head against her. They'd turn back to whatever it was they'd been watching on the television before he came in. Nothing more would be said between them. Very little ever was. Sandy would be quiet, knowing that if he made too much noise he'd be sent straight back to his room. Sometimes he'd lie with his eyes wide open, not watching the TV, but watching one or other of his parents. It seemed such a long time ago, like another life. It seemed strange that she could even remember it now. It seemed strange, too, that this sleeping man had been that sleeping little boy, with his mop of brown hair and checked pyjamas. It seemed impossible. "Come on, Sandy." She rested her hand on his head and stroked his cheek, her finger brushing the edge of his ear. "Come on, son. It's time to get up. It's time for supper." David wasn't smiling when he arrived at the front door. "Where are we going exactly?" Sandy asked. "We're going up to the ditch along the edge of the big park." David looked up and nodded in the general direction. David was striding faster than was comfortable on the steep side of the valley. He knew exactly where he was heading, and Sandy felt strange about it. Then David stopped. and Sandy saw why. Lying in the shallow ditch at the corner of the field was a lamb. Its eyes were scarlet holes dug by the crows, but otherwise it was intact. Intact and dead. The animal was lying on its front, splayed out as though it had belly flopped in, but its head was caught inside a broken square of wire in the fence. One end of the wire had stuck into its neck, but there wasn't much blood, so it hadn't punctured anything vital. There was mud splashed around on the grass from the struggle, and its back legs too were filthy. The lamb had died trying to escape. "Shit," Sandy said. "Yeah, shit. How did you ken it was here? I could see it for the road. Du should have seen it too. Du should have seen it." "Right. I guess we need to bury her then. That's what the shovel's for, isn't it?" "No. We don't need to bury her. Du needs to bury her." David handed the shovel over. "Where?" "Anywhere you can dig a hole big enough. Keep her away from the ditch and away from the burn. Get done at least a metre. That's the rules." The digging wasn't easy. Every bite the shovel took hit stones just beneath the surface. Nowhere did the earth look soft enough to dig a grave. In a patch of darker green at the bottom of the big park, Sandy stopped and plunged his shovel deep into the earth again. It felt softer, and he lay the animal down beside him and started to dig. He had almost enough time to feel relieved when, a foot beneath the surface, the blade struck a rock, which turned out to be a boulder. He threw the shovel. The point of it struck the lamb's face, then bounced off beyond. Sandy lay down and looked up at the sky. The morning wasn't warm, but in his bowler suit he was comfortable enough. He was thinking now of Emma. He missed her. He stretched out there on the grass, letting the day surround and enclose him. Sandy reached his arm and stroked the lamb's head. He closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the valley and of the sea. When he woke, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. The valley seemed strangely still. Sandy imagined for a moment that, while he was sleeping, everyone in the valley had died. He imagined himself a kind of Rip Van Winkle, fallen asleep for decades and woken to a valley empty of people. How long would it be, he wondered, before no one was left living there? He began again to dig. Before long he had a hole about a metre deep and wide enough to fit the lamb. He didn't throw it in, but instead placed the animal gently at the bottom. He tapped it all down with his boot, then turned and headed back towards the house. Closing the gate, Sandy heard a car come down the road. It was David's pickup. He stood and waited. "Aye, aye," said David, leaning out of the window. "You got her buried?" Sandy nodded. "Just so the kens. Joe and Ryan are moving out of the right house." "How come?" "They were taking the piss, exploiting me like yon. They was right to let me ken. I'm giving them a month's notice." "That seems a bit extreme." "Aye, maybe. But I gied to discuss it with them, and Ryan just wouldn't accept that he was doing anything wrong. I thought that we could sort it out between us, but he wasn't interested. So I sorted it myself." Sandy looked at him for a moment, then walked back towards the house. He took the phone from his pocket, found Emma's number, and dialed. The flapjacks were nearly done when David returned. Mary sat opposite him, smiling. "What's up with thee?" he asked. "It looks like there's won the lottery, or else there's been pinching me whisky." "No, not that," she said. "But I've got good news. Emma's coming home." "Coming home? As in back to stay?" "No, David, just for a holiday, later in the summer. She phoned this afternoon to say she'd booked the flight." "Well, that's great news. He bit into a flapjack and nodded, then grinned. "I'll maybe let her ken the right hoose is free again, though, just in case." Mary laughed. Sandy leaned back against the wall and sighed, removing the winter cuts. Cutting the year's growth away felt like an achievement. It brought relief to the sheep, who were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable, but it also brought a tangible outcome, with a great mound of greasy wool left over at the end of the day. Sandy clipped, as he'd been taught, with hand shears rather than electric clippers. "Yon electric things is just too noisy," David had told him, by which Sandy understood him to mean too easy. Sandy continued like this, bending, then straightening, bending, then straightening, doing his best to calm the fidgety yow as he removed her tight-fitted winter jacket, clip after clip. "Hey, Sandy." He looked up, surprised. Joe was standing at the gate just behind him. "Hello," he said, raising the shears in greeting. "How are you doing? I've not seen you in a while." "Actually, I've come to say goodbye, really. I suppose David told you he's chucking us out?" "I don't blame him, I suppose, but I am sorry. I liked it here. At the moment, I have no idea what I want to do. Part of me feels like just jacking my job in and moving away." "And Ryan?" "Yes, I feel like jacking him in too," she laughed, then paused. "I wanted to say sorry, though, about the party. I know it's a while ago now, but I haven't had a chance. I was very drunk. I'm sorry if I was confusing." "Well, yeah, I'm easily confused. You're the least of it, to be honest." "Drink's a dangerous thing," she smiled. "Aye, it can make you tell the truth to strangers. You're no stranger, Sandy." "No, I guess no." They faced each other. "I'm really sorry," he said. "I wish you were staying." "I know. And it's okay." Sandy wondered if she knew it was him who'd told David about the house. She and Ryan must have suspected. They must have guessed. But then, this was Shetland. It could have been anyone. Ryan wasn't exactly secretive about it. He'd almost boasted. Perhaps she had no idea. "Well, take care," he said. "Yes, you too. And you've got me number, so just text me if you fancy meeting up in town sometime. It'd be nice to see you, really." He nodded. "I will do," he said, though he knew that he wouldn't. Jo leaned forward and put her arms around him. 2 seconds, maybe 3. "See you, Sandy," she said, then turned and walked away. "Do you need a hand?" Sandy was standing wet-haired at the bottom of the stairs. "No, I think everything's under control," Liz said. "You can pour yourself a glass of wine, if you want. I'll hae something when Dad arrives." "I'm sure he'll be here any time now. Are you nervous?" Sandy didn't answer. Just went back upstairs until a knock at the front door brought him down again. "Hey, Dad. How are you?" Jim stood in the porch, dressed like a man who wasn't sure what was required of him. He had on a smart grey shirt, tucked into a pair of faded jeans with a pair of work boots below. Put together, they made him look more like an off-duty cowboy than a lonely, late-middle-aged council employee. "I'm okay, son. Quiet week." "I'm okay." Sandy nodded. "You didn't have to come out today. I wouldn't have been offended." I ken, it's fine." Liz stood listening to them talk until, when the pleasantries were done, Jim turned to her. Aye, Lizzie." He extended his hand hesitantly. She could see in his face that he regretted it. A handshake wasn't right at all. But she took it and smiled, squeezing his palm between both of hers, then let go. The 3 of them sat around the little table in the kitchen. Liz carved the lamb and served it out, together with the roast potatoes, peas, and carrots. She poured the wine and said, "Cheers," and was the perfect host, and the two men went along with it, not saying much at all. "So, how long is thou planning on staying?" Jim asked, swigging back the last of his wine. Liz raised her eyebrows, then looked at her plate where a half potato lay in a puddle of gravy. She saw Sandy turn to her, waiting for her reply. "Well, I wasn't sure when I came back if I'd feel like being home for more than a month or two, but I'm enjoying it. More than I thought, anyway. I've started looking for jobs." "So is thou going to rely on Sandy's hospitality indefinitely?" "No, not at all. I'll be leaving soon, I think." "Uh-huh," Sandy said. His mouth was full, but the question mark was audible. "I think I'll be out of your hair in a week or two, all being well. I've spoken to David. The Red House is going to be free from next weekend, and I asked if I could move in, on a trial basis anyway. He was delighted. He said it saved him the trouble of advertising and interviewing and all that. Suits us both, it seems. And you, Sandy." Sandy's chewing had slowed as she spoke, and now it stopped entirely. "How does it suit me, exactly?" "I thought my moving up the road would be good for us both." "No, it'd be good for you, not for me." "I don't understand. You don't want me to go, but you don't want me to stay." "No, I do want you to go. And I don't care where you go particularly. I just don't want you staying here in the valley. This is my home, no yours." "So what am I supposed to do then?" Sandy shrugged and stood. "Start looking for somewhere else. Find your own home. There's plenty of other places to live in Shetland. Just pick one and stick with it." He left the table and went to the front door. Outside, he drove the car up the road to Kettlester and went in without knocking. David and Mary were sat in the kitchen. David nodded as Sandy came in. "Aye, aye, boy, the kettle's just boiled." "You canna help it, can you?" said Sandy. "Interfering in folks' lives. You canna help trying to control everything and everyone in this valley. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of you trying to choose my future for me. It's not thine to decide. I'm sick of it." His voice trailed off, and he stood beside the door. No words left to throw. His anger gone. It was Mary who rose from her seat and came towards him then. She put her arms out, and he allowed her to encircle him, to hold him, as he leaned into her shoulder. "Come and sit down," she said. "Come and sit down." Terry forced his eyes open. The lights were still on in the room. Sandy was sleeping, his mouth agape, with a half-empty bottle of beer beside him. Terry remembered arriving at Geordie, a bag of bottles in his hand. He'd been drunk already, then he was drunker. Sandy followed, taking swigs of whiskey, swigs of beer. He'd been purposeful about it, not quite himself somehow. Things grew dim after that, then gone, swallowed by sleep and by drink. He needed a cigarette. He stumbled forward through the hallway to the kitchen. He tripped on a cardboard box beside the table, but he grabbed the countertop and stayed upright. Top drawer, no matches. Second drawer, no matches. The stove was the last resort. He stood, hands on the counter, and gazed at the dials on the front. Squinted. He pressed and turned one, anti-clockwise, smelt the gas, then pushed the igniter button. A ring of blue light. He looked at it for a few seconds, half hypnotized, forgetting why he'd made it dance like this. He felt the warmth rising. Then he remembered. Leaned forward, sucking as the tobacco touched the flame. Smoke rushed into his mouth, his lungs, and he closed his eyes. He felt himself wobble. felt his arms slacken. Then a wall of heat against his face, for a second only. It was pleasant. Comfortable. Then it wasn't. His lashes singed first. He smelt them, acrid, and opened his eyes as his face dropped into the flame. Jesus! He threw himself backwards into the room. He jumped, stepped, tripped again on the box, then fell, his skull finding the ground. He cupped his hands over his clenched eyes. He wanted to shout to Sandy for help, but he didn't want Sandy to know how stupid he'd been. He didn't want anyone to know how stupid he had been. He tried to look upwards, but everything was tight and sharp and hot. He saw something. A light, perhaps. A flicker. A shadow. Then nothing. For hours, Alice had lain awake. She lay, eyes closed, assailed by questions, longing her thoughts to be quiet, to leave her alone, at least until morning. But the churning and wondering went on until, a little after 4, she gave in and got up. She stood, put on her dressing gown and slippers, and went to the window. From there, she could see down to Gardy. The house was, as she'd always known it, settled snugly just above the beach, as though it were left there by some long receded glacier. It looked inevitable somehow, like a circle of standing stones. Without it, the valley would be incomplete. The white stucco walls were in the shadow still, offset by the reflection of the sun glittering in the kitchen window. Except that, no. If the walls were in shadow, it couldn't be the sun. Alice looked harder, trying to understand what her eyes were seeing. There was a flickering on the glass, and a glow. But it wasn't a reflection. The light was not on the glass. It was behind it. The morning was close to silent as she pulled up and turned off the engine, but inside everything was noise. She had not been wrong. The house was on fire. She called David. No answer on the mobile. She called the house. It rang 6 times before the click. Mary answered. Her voice was quiet, muffled by sleep. Alice could hear a tremor of concern in that single word, "Hello?" A call at this time of the morning is almost never good news. She said it quickly. She didn't pause to let Mary speak. She just said it. "Gardy is on fire." And she ran to the front door. Smoke billowed thick and dirty around the ceiling, and the whole place was murky, half visible, as though in the process of being erased. Alice squinted into the living room. Sandy was drooped over the armchair. She grabbed his dangling arm. "Sandy! Sandy! Wake up!" He shrugged and swiveled in his chair. She pulled harder. This time he opened his eyes, drew the back of his hand across his lips, and looked down at Alice, confused. Then he looked up at the fire. "Come on!" Alice shouted. "We've got to get out!" "Terry," he said, as they got to the hall. She opened the door to the porch just as David was coming in from outside. He grabbed at Sandy's collar and lifted him to his feet. "Take him," she said to David. "I just need to check." She turned. There was no one in the living room. But when she turned again to the kitchen, she stopped. She saw feet, legs. "Terry!" It was hot now. She tried to wake him. He didn't move. Alice didn't hear David come up behind her. She just felt his grip on her shoulder. "We had to be quick." The two of them slipped their hands beneath Terry's armpits and turned them round. Shuffling together, Alice could feel the heat searing through her t-shirt. They hauled Terry into the porch, where the air was clearer, and continued, easing him through the front door, over the step, and onto the path. "He's breathing," Mary said. "Not very well by the looks of it, but he's definitely breathing." Mary brought a coat from the car and wrapped it round Alice's shoulders. Alice felt the older woman's arms around her, and she leaned her head against them and closed her eyes. The ambulance arrived first, hurtling down the valley. Mary watched as Terry was laid out on a stretcher with an oxygen mask over his mouth. She hugged Sandy, then led him to the back of the ambulance. "I'll follow on," said David before they closed the door. "I'll see thee shortly, boy." Sandy nodded, not looking up. A few minutes later, the fire engine appeared at the top of the road. Mary spoke quietly. "We'll need to get out of the way." "Right," said David, reaching out his hand. "Alice, they'll need to join Wes." "Thank you," she said, her face streaked with tears. "I will." "No, Alice. Thank you." David put his arms around her then. "I dunna like to think what would have happened if thou hadna seen. If thou hadna—" He held her for a moment longer, then stood back, his hands still on her arms. "I tell't thee there was always stories," David said. "This thing belongs to thee." David sat in the truck outside the Red House and waited. He'd beeped the horn so Sandy would be on his way. It had been years since he'd owned a boat. Since his father died, in fact, he'd been without one. They used to fish together. Afterwards, David lost the inclination. But this year he'd been thinking again about the sea. In a week of sunshine in early July, he'd scanned through the adverts in the paper and found a man in Scalloway with a 14-foot Shetland model for sale. The wind died down, and the forecast was good. The fine weather would coincide with Emma's visit. She was due to arrive this lunchtime. Mary would go to the airport to collect her, so he and Sandy could have a couple of hours on the water this morning, and maybe bring home some fish, if they were lucky. The trip was not entirely for his benefit, though. It was Sandy who really needed it. Since the fire, he'd not been himself. He'd gone back to work a few days later, no problem at all, but things weren't right. He wasn't ill exactly, he just wasn't doing anything beyond the essential. He managed the bare minimum down at the croft. He could hold a conversation without enthusiasm, but he just didn't seem entirely present. Sandy emerged from the front door carrying a small rucksack and a jacket. He walked with his head turned down the valley, almost crab-like. "Aye, aye, Sandy. Has you got that thing does needing?" "Uh-huh." "Okay." Beyond the headland, the boat began to bounce, and David pulled back on the throttle and pointed them south into the breeze. "We'll try here," David said. He told Sandy the maid, the formula of sightlines that brought them to this spot. He'd strung the rods up with teams of brightly coloured fleas and a light weight. He handed one across the boat. David's thoughts circled and swooped, yet were tethered, somehow, to that thin line that disappeared beneath him, reaching down into a world he could not see and could hardly even imagine. His thoughts were tied to that stillness below. At the end of the second fishless drift, David turned and looked northwards to the far side of the bay. There, a score of gannets were diving, one after the other, and he nodded to Sandy in their direction. "Maybe they ken mair as we do," he said, reeling up and fastening the fleas in place again. "I reckon they likely do." The little boat crossed the bay with the wind behind them. Both of them swung their rods out and flipped the levers, let the weights fall, stopped, then struck. Once, twice, 3 times, they hit fish at the same moment. Jerking and jolting like mad things, the mackerel flipped and leapt like popping corn. They had enough fish to last them for weeks. "Hum," he said. It sounded like a question, but it wasn't. Sandy just nodded, smiled. David turned round and pulled the cord on the engine. This time it didn't catch. He took the choke out and hauled again at the cord. Nothing. Primed it. Nothing. He looked at the outboard then. hoping some solution might occur to him. But it didn't. "Do you ken anything about engines?" "No, nothing." "What about the rowing?" "I think I can manage that." Sandy changed seats, and David watched as he set the oars in place and began to row. "How's the midder?" David asked. Sandy looked back. "I think she's fine," he said. "She's got a flat in tune and a job in the co-op." He raised his eyebrows. "Maybe she'll stick it out, I dinna ken." "And what about thee? How's do?" David watched and waited. Dinna worry about me. I'll stick it out, if you still want me to." David nodded and smiled back. "Yeah, we do. We do." Sandy began to row again, heaving into the wark. David could see the sweat shimmer on his forehead, and he knew that he was tired, but he wasn't going to take over, not this time. Two figures appeared on the beach, arm in arm, walking slowly over the rocks. David saw his wife and his youngest daughter, and he willed himself nearer. In the moments of their approach, Emma came down to the water's edge, and David watched, helpless, as she lifted her arm in the air and smiled. Sandy, turning, saw her too, and pulled harder at the oars, his body urging the boat towards home.
Stephen Robertson was reading The Valley at the Centre of the World by Malachy Tallack. It was abridged by Robin Brooks, and the producer is Ailey McCready.